Hey, my name's Nathan, this is the Future Game Show, and reviews can be a great way to ensure that we, as dirty, soulless consumers, are informed about the games we're interested in buying in advance of us slamming down our dollar before the checkout staff say, "Sir, I'm very sorry, but this copy of Bluey the video game costs more than a singular dollar."
Well, this is the last time I rent here.
You'll be missed.
Screw you!
But sometimes there's a shocking schism between what the critics think of a game and how the players receive it, where paying customers clearly have a very different time with a game than professional reviewers. And that doesn't mean that either camp is right or wrong here, but it does create a fascinating point for comparison. So hey, why don't we look at a selection of games that did exactly that? This is the top 10 games that critics and fans could not agree on. And one of these entries has been picked by your very selves from the comments of last week's video. And hey, that reminds me, if you want to get involved in next week's video, then comment below on what you think the best PS1 game of all time is. Oh, that's going to be a good one. Right. Let's get on with it. Days Gone. Sony's hotly anticipated AAA zombie action adventure Days Gone was met with a staunchly mediocre critical reception at launch, with critics unfavourably comparing it to basically every other first-party PlayStation 4 exclusive that had zombies and a gruff, boring, brown-haired male protagonist. The consensus was that it never really rose above being a generic open-world action-adventure, while suffering from a forgettable story, unappealing protagonist, overabundance of bugs, and playtime that grossly outstayed its welcome. John Garvin, the lead developer, disagreed with a lot of these comments though, tweeting that the bad reception was instead because of woke reviewers who couldn't deal with a gruff white biker looking at his date's ass. And if you're wondering what that noise is in the background, reading that statement out loud just set off my recently installed cringe detection system, so good to know that that's working. Yep, money well spent. Player reception to Days Gone was decidedly sunnier, though, with user reviews sitting in a much more positive state. There's a couple of potential reasons for this though. Firstly, that the game launched in a bit of a janky state, so the press got to play a version that was much buggier than what players finally got their hands on. And secondly, potentially critics are a bit more likely to be burned out on lengthy AAA open world experiences, having to play so many of them for work, while those who are playing this game purely for fun are maybe a bit more forgiving of some of that repetition and excess. I don't know, just a couple of theories. But in the end, Days Gone's middling critical reception was reportedly instrumental in Sony deciding not to greenlight a sequel. Sorry John, looks like Sony just couldn't handle a gruff biker staring at his date's ass. Oh god, there goes that alarm again. And our entry from the comments this week goes to @StewieMon, who chose Spec Ops The Line. If you take a quick glance at the Metacritic page for Spec Ops The Line, you'd assume it was a slightly above average game from 2012 that played almost exactly like every other game from 2012. But that's kind of the point. You see, Spec Ops The Line is this bizarre little gem that was taken into the hearts and minds of fans that recognised it as a surreal, twisted take on the military shooter. The fact that it played so similarly to its contemporaries was kind of the whole central premise to the game, as it then slowly and subtly started to warp the very game around you with hallucinatory sequences, fourth wall breaks, and perhaps one of the most harrowing moments in games ever. While some critics heralded Spec Ops as an unusual triumph amongst a sea of military shooters, quite a lot of reviewers couldn't get past the fact that, yeah, sure, it's doing interesting things, but it really does just play like every other military shooter, which, yeah, it's hard to disagree with. In the end though, Spec Ops The Line has developed a strong cult classic status as the years have gone on, strengthened by a dedicated fan base. Although it's just been pulled from Steam, so good luck trying to play it. Final Fantasy XIII. Though Final Fantasy XIII wasn't as lovingly embraced by reviewers as the best games in the series, it still received high marks from most major outlets who praised it for its stunning visuals and fluid combat. But within days of release, fans vocally expressed their displeasure at the RPG's shocking linearity compared to previous Final Fantasy entries. The game's first 10 chapters are often fondly referred to as the 15-hour corridor, Add to this a story that's convoluted and divisive even for this series standards, and it's little surprise that for most fans they consider Final Fantasy XIII to be one of the franchise's weakest mainline installments. Where this game called anything but Final Fantasy, would player reception have been, a bit kinder? Who knows? But as a long-awaited entry in the most iconic RPG property of all time, this wasn't it, Chief. DMC Devil May Cry. Despite a tidal wave of negativity leading up to its release, 2013's Devil May Cry reboot actually ended up as one of the series' most critically acclaimed entries. Reviewers tripped over themselves to sing the praises of the combat, the art style, the edgier tone, and even the redesign of protagonist Dante. And to say that long-time Devil May Cry fans disagreed is quite the understatement. And it did feel as if fans had made up their minds about the very idea of a reboot long before this game even got onto store shelves. Even beyond the fact that they simply hated Dante's redesign, there was little love for the game's aggressively obnoxious, in-your-face punk vibe and more casual, friendly difficulty. Given that Capcom clearly expected this to be the new creative direction for the franchise moving forward, fans brought along a whole lot of baggage to the game that critics didn't. Years later, Capcom admitted defeat and reverted back to the series' classic style, but this reboot is still one of the fandom's least favourite entries. But to be fair, it does have a well-earned cult following. I liked it. Diablo IV. To look at the reviews of Diablo IV, you'd assume it was another great installment in the beloved dungeon-crawling RPG franchise, with many even deeming it one of the best games ever produced by Blizzard. But it didn't take long after launch for players to begin slinging ire at the publisher for the state of the game. Chief complaints included the poor loot system, clunky UI, lack of matchmaking, and underwhelming endgame content. On both Steam and Metacritic, user reviews quickly skewed to mixed at best, with plenty of outright vitriol for an experience largely viewed as wildly inferior to the series' prior titles. This ensured that even many diehard fans dropped Diablo IV shortly after launch, and almost a year on from its release, it still remains hugely polarising. Such is the double-edged sword of live service games. Critics only review the launch day content, while players are experiencing it as a fluid, evolving piece of work, for better, but often worse. Terminator Resistance. If you look at the reviews for Terminator Resistance at face value, it appeared to be a sci-fi FPS that was yet another soulless attempt to cash in on a name brand. Critics largely dismissed it as a generic and forgettable shooter, but the response from players, who had been starved of any quality Terminator content for years, was far more appreciative. Though clearly produced on a scant budget, Resistance was also evidently made by people with a real love for James Cameron's original two movies, melding a fittingly grotty aesthetic with a whole host of fan service while making the Terminators genuinely scary again. Resistance delivered the basic goods, and you know what? Sometimes that is more than enough. Nobody's calling the game a masterpiece, but it evidently did far more for the precise people it was made for than the critics. Dragon Age 2. Even though reviewers generally accepted that Dragon Age 2 wasn't nearly as great as its predecessor Dragon Age Origins, there was still a comfortable consensus that it was a rock-solid RPG well worth your time. But to this very day, almost 15 years after release, a large swath of the series' fanbase still absolutely loathe this game for feeling like it was a huge regression from the original. Dragon Age 2's most cardinal sins include its woefully limited setting, blatant asset reuse throughout, and simplified combat and dialogue systems. It was just painfully clear that BioWare had been forced to rush this thing out and on a budget. The entire game was produced under an intense crunch period in just 16 months. My god, that's insane! Those poor developers. The sequel isn't without its fans, but the gulf of opinion between critical and player consensus is one for the ages. The Dragon Ages, you might say. Ho ho! Got 'em! Mass Effect 3. BioWare strikes again. To look at Mass Effect 3's Metacritic score of 93, it appears to be one of the most acclaimed RPGs of all time, in turn delivering a satisfying conclusion to the studio's much-loved sci-fi trilogy. But when players started finishing the game for themselves, the tide took a violent turn as fans en masse expressed crushing disappointment with its ending. After BioWare promised players that their choices throughout the trilogy would culminate in a meaningful, tailored climax, Mass Effect 3's ending simply asked the player to pick a colour and watch a cutscene unfold. The deflating finale utterly dominated the game's launch discourse, enough so that BioWare even eventually updated it with a more fleshed out ending. But where the game's public reception was concerned, the damage was already done. As for why the critics still praised it to the heavens, well, it isn't hard, is it? As a standalone game, Mass Effect 3 was far from bad. But what are the critics reviewing here? The conclusion to the trilogy or the game itself? Or both? It's a tough one, and this is certainly not a bad game. Even so, the chasm of opinion between critics and players in this case still remains absolutely colossal. Postal 2. Even back in the Wild West of the early noughties, game reviewers were utterly exhausted by Postal 2, an FPS so self-consciously edgy it left Grand Theft Auto weeping in the corner and muttering, "Won't you please think of the children?" The game, which invites players to embark on a murderous rampage where they can urinate on members of the public and kill Gary Coleman, simply left many critics irritated by its mere presence. A game that was being offensive for no other reason than being offensive, which presumably is precisely why it went down a storm with general players, many of whom we can assume were teenagers, like myself when I first played it and loved it. Postal 2 gave fans an excuse to embrace the most unhinged wants of their little goblin gamer brains, to bathe in its transgressive dark humour, and even attack an in-game version of developer running with scissors own offices. Don't forget to pee on their desks! Hell yeah! However, critics and fans at least agree that the third and fourth Postal games were absolutely rotten. So there we go, we do achieve harmony sometimes. The Last of Us Part 2. Could anything else be number one? The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most critically acclaimed video games of the last decade, a technical landmark from developer Naughty Dog, and one of the most boldly provocative gaming narratives ever produced. The fan reaction, however, was a hot mess, with many expressing disappointment with a certain early game character death, the introduction of additional protagonist Abby, and how the game blurred the lines between hero and villain. While there were absolutely some bad apples who simply hated this game for daring to be inclusive, oh my god, how dare they, there were also many who took genuine umbrage with its fundamental creative direction. Naughty Dog certainly took some big risks with the narrative throughline, and while critics were largely appreciative of these huge swings, more emotionally invested fans just simply couldn't accept that things had strayed so far from what they expected. It's a fascinating topic really, and I love the debate around The Last of Us 2. I mean, if only someone had made a video recently discussing this very matter. Oh wait, I did, me did. So why not go check that out? It's a good one, I promise. So there you go, 10 games that critics and fans just could not agree on. If you like that, then we've got loads of other great stuff over on the FGS channel, so why not head over there, subscribe, and watch every single video from start to finish. It'll only take you, I don't know, about 4 to 6 months of your life. Come on, don't be lazy. And hey, that reminds me, if you want to get involved in next week's video, then comment below on what you think the best PS1 game of all time is. Oh, that's going to be a good one.